Okay, hello and welcome to everybody to Illinois Learn to Hunt, Deer Hunting Strategies and Stand Placement. First things first, you do not need your videos turned on at all during this presentation, so you can leave those off. Same with microphones. If you have any questions at all, you can put them in the chat and we will get to them as we are able to. Either the person who is talking can answer the question if they're able to, or they can answer in the chat. So just to keep out background noise, please turn your microphones off and leave your videos off. And yes, it is free. So yeah, so with all that, and also just so you know, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint tomorrow in an email along with a recording of this that will link you to a YouTube video where we upload the video to. And you also have a survey so you guys can get back to us with any constructive criticism or any praise that you might have for us after you guys
How come I can't hear him, Bill?
So sure. So yeah, so please make sure you're muted. If you're having any issues hearing us, let us know, and we'll also put that in the chat. So if at any time we drop out of the presentation, please let us know if you're not hearing us. There are two of us here tonight, so one of us will pick up where the other one left off if someone gets kicked out of their internet service. So the other presenter here tonight is Dan. Dan, if you'd like to say hi.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Great. And then I'm Jason Buckley. I'll be also here going over some of this information. This is going to be a really fun course that we have set up here tonight. We're going to go over some deer biology and then go over the seasonal approaches to deer hunting and then the seasonal stand placement using that ecology in the background that we're going to lay out and how that's going to inform you on where you want to put your stands at on a given property. And then we're going to cover some hunting tactics and then the setups of your stands as you go out this fall. So to start us off with some deer ecology, Dan, you can get it going.
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And before we get too into, kind of hunting strategies and going over some different tree stand and different hunting site locations, I always like to first start off with kind of some fundamental deer ecology, which will probably be a review for the majority of you. But I think it'll help us kind of set the stage for how we approach this course today. We're going to take kind of a unique approach in that we're going to kind of move along with deer season seasonally. So we're going to start off in early October, and then we're going to kind of progress through the different seasons. And in each of those seasons, we'll go over some kind of basic deer behavior, deer feeding patterns that you expect to see during that particular time of the season. And then we'll go over some basic strategies that you can hopefully utilize to capitalize on some of those ecological concepts that we discussed. So again, we're going to first start off with just some basic fundamental deer behavior and deer ecology. So optimal habitat. Deer, particularly white-tailed deer, which we have in Illinois, you can see in this range map here in the bottom left that they cover the majority of the country. And they prefer a kind of mix of both young and mature forest. If you follow hunting culture and watch hunting videos and things like this, a lot of times you'll see these really nice, pristine, mature hardwood stands. And while those can be effective for deer hunting, it's not areas that deer particularly like to spend a lot of time. They like to be in a lot of these thicker areas. So keep that in mind as we kind of progress through this conversation, is don't kind of rely on what you've seen in some of the different hunting shows and different videos and things like that, because those are kind of set up to make for a good filmed hunt. So they want these really nice open woodlands instead of some of these more thicker areas, which is where you typically find success in the deer woods. So some basic deer behavior. Rut is the primary breeding season for the white-tailed deer. October to December kind of encompasses all of rut, but really the peak of rut is typically early November to kind of the second week of November is when you kind of have peak breeding activity. And we'll discuss that a little bit later on. Most deer are what we refer to as crepuscular. So we have nocturnal species, which are active at night. We have diurnal species, which are active during the day. And then we have this classification called crepuscular, which is essentially active during the twilight hours, so dawn and dusk. Obviously, deer have very good smell. As hunters, we all know how important it is to have proper scent control when you're deer hunting, particularly if you're archery hunting, where it typically requires you to be a little bit closer to that animal. You really want to keep that scent control in mind. And a lot of the strategies that we'll kind of utilize today and discuss tonight, we'll try to use the wind and use some of the different terrain features to kind of guide your scent, as well as to hopefully set you in a place that a deer can't come up and sneak behind you and get downwind at you. So we will discuss that a little bit later. Fawns are precocious, and this essentially means that they exhibit a very mature adolescence. So they're very mature at a very young age, which is why oftentimes you will see them as kind of leaders on the trails. So now we'll go over a little bit about doe bedding, and I really focus on doe bedding a lot, and you'll see that kind of as this conversation progresses, that doe bedding is so crucial to how we can effectively hunt whitetails. It's really important to pay attention to where does are bedding and how often they are utilizing those bedding areas. So we just typically want to go over some basics about doe bedding areas. Does are going to tend to kind of group up in family groups. The nice thing about doe beds is they are a lot easier to stumble upon rather than your buck beds, because again, they're typically in these open kind of prairie grass fields, so they're typically easier to find. Now, the does are still going to take precautions to hide and conceal themselves, but you're much more likely to just kind of accidentally stumble upon their bedding area than you will a buck. A buck is very discreet and very specific about the specific bed that he chooses. So oftentimes it's not going to be an area where you're constantly walking through. Does are a lot more likely to kind of linger around high traffic areas. They're not near as concerned about human pressure and human scent as bucks are. They'll be a lot more open in some of their bedding choices. Now, they do typically like to bed in these tall grass prairies. That is a pretty standard doe bedding area across the country. So those are always worth checking into. And to find and kind of confirm that it's an active bed, you'll see basically what you see in this picture. You'll have this huge depression that's typically 3 to 4 feet across, where it looks like something large just kind of laid down. And if it's a real active bed and real recent, a lot of times you can still see little portions of hair in the bed. You might find some scat, and you might also pick up on a particular scent. It might be kind of a muskiness, but what that is just their urine. So typically before they get out of bed, they're going to stand up, urinate, defecate, and then leave the bed. And so if it's a fairly recent bed, you can start to see some of that sign still present. Now, in kind of complete contrast, we have the male beds, so the buck beds. Buck beds are typically more secluded, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, but they're also a lot more discreet. So essentially, does typically have 2 or 3 different bedding areas that they may use depending on weather and things like that, and pressure. But bucks may have upwards of 10 to even a dozen different beds, and they typically pick these beds based on a very specific wind direction. So if you're ever walking through the woods and you happen to jump up a buck out of his bed, it's a really good idea to go ahead and note where that was, but also pay attention to the wind direction. Because they want to be set up in an area that they can basically cover all sides. So typically they're going to be in a bed kind of like this, where they have a nice lay down behind themselves that kind of protects them. And then they're going to set up in a way that the wind is basically blowing right to them from wherever they expect some kind of predator to come to. But for bucks, you're really looking for that thick cover that whitetails are known to spend a lot of time in. And now, where bucks bed is really going to dictate or be dictated by how much pressure is on that specific hunting site. For instance, if it's private land that only gets hunted during maybe firearm season, those bucks aren't going to be as specific about their beds as, let's say, maybe a 4.5-year-old buck who's on a public site. where he runs into hunters every other day. He hears rattles, he hears calls, he's getting called at every day. He's going to be very specific about where he beds. Where a private land deer, you can probably get away with a little bit more, and he's probably got just a handful of beds as opposed to the public land whitetail. Now, typically, if you find an active bed and it happens to look like a buck bedding area, if it's around October, begin to look for rubs and scrapes. Rubs and scrapes are typically prominent in a buck's kind of core range. So whitetail have kind of a unique, let's just say a unique home range. So they have this really tight core range where they kind of spend the majority of their time, and they view that as their territory. And then they have kind of this larger range where they might kind of venture off to, maybe go seek out and try to chase a few does and just kind of go all over. But if you happen to find a nice rub line and scrapes, there's a pretty likely chance that there's a bedded buck within that core area, or at least an area that a buck is going to bed in. Bucks are typically bedded near a year-round source of water, particularly if that property has a year-round supply of water. I know all properties don't, but if that is present, typically bucks really like to prefer to be bedded somewhat near that. And it's not just because of the fact that there's water there and abundant vegetation, but it also makes it a lot easier to catch the scent off of the predators that kind of blow that over the water. It allows, we've all been kind of adjacent on a lake or a pond, and that water just kind of come ripping across there. And so it's kind of the same concept. Other areas that bucks tend to kind of favor for bedding areas, they really like high areas where they can kind of see their surroundings. They might also be in covered areas that still offer a pretty good visibility of maybe an open field that's adjacent. So that might be a ridgetop or kind of just woodsy areas, but they also really, really, really need escape routes. Excuse me, sorry, I had to take a quick drink. But they need escape routes. So does, again, are going to be bedded in family groups. And ecologically, there's a few different kind of predator avoidance adaptations that mammals utilize. And one of those is basically the flashing or the mobbing effect. And if you've ever walked through a doe bedding area and you've seen, maybe a half dozen or a dozen whitetails, just kind of take off and start running, and they're giving you that big white fan, that's for a reason. It's an adaptation for predator avoidance. Because picture you quail hunting. If you're out quail hunting and you pick up a covey of quail, oftentimes there might be 12 to 24 birds that fly up at once. It's very hard as a hunter to focus on a specific individual when there's a group of them like that. And so does don't need to be as reliant on the particular vegetation and location of their bed. They're utilizing kind of a bunch of eyes, a bunch of ears, as well as kind of that mobbing predator avoidance technique. One thing I want to highlight really quickly before we really start diving into kind of this seasonal approach to tree stand placement is, over the years, and especially when I first started hunting and when I first started talking to hunters, a lot of people will kind of come up with a set plan for the season, and they'll kind of stick with that plan. And that's the approach we're going to take today. Instead of solely relying on maybe a particular stand that just, for 5 or 10 years has been very productive, but maybe the past few it's not, we're going to talk about being mobile and being active and adjusting your setup in ways that can really be advantageous. But it's important to match those variations and those setup adjustments with the seasonal ecology of deer. Let's, just as a quick example, you're probably not going to hunt deer the same way on Halloween as you would on January 15th. If you happen to do it that way, you can still have success, but hopefully with a few of the things we're going to discuss today, that you will hopefully pick up a few different techniques to increase your likelihood of success. And so it's really important to first understand seasonal variation of a whitetail's diet. So deer are what is considered browsers, right? So they're going to nibble off on twigs, on leaves of trees, on shrubs, on basically any plant using their lower front teeth. But in different areas, they will also graze. So they will eat grasses, particularly in more urban settings where there might not be big oak and acorn populations. They will graze on grasses, but they do prefer to kind of browse. And so this is just a quick illustration of what a lot of us see in Illinois. You know, early October is when archery season starts, October 1st. A lot of times there are still a substantial amount of crops in the ground. And come, you know, November, a lot of those crops are gone, unless it's last year where we had a really late harvest in a lot of places. But it's just really important to also understand how agriculture affects deer movement. I mentioned earlier that tall grass prairies can be extremely good doe bedding areas. A standing cornfield basically acts as the exact same principle. There's been multiple studies that have shown deer basically living, you know, their entire day inside a standing cornfield. They have adequate food, they have good cover, they also can get moisture either through the food that they're ingesting, but also a lot of times if there's a rain event or there's going to be some kind of drainage in that near that field. So don't count out agriculture fields. Even if they're maybe not on your property, they are still going to affect how the deer move and feed in that specific area. Another really important food source that almost all hunters are aware of is acorns. So acorns are king in the whitetail world, particularly as kind of a natural occurring food source. It really aids deer in storing up fat reserves for winter. If a buck is very active during rut, there's been lots of documented instances where bucks, particularly mature bucks, will lose upwards of 20 to 30% of their body weight just during those few months of rut. So it's really important that they pack on those fats and those carbohydrates during, you know, before winter. Otherwise, chances that they make it through the winter diminish. And so they are really going to be focusing on acorns kind of later on in the season. We'll discuss that a little bit later. But it's important to know that acorn production is cyclical. It's not going to be the same every single year. Some years you'll have a higher yield, maybe 2 years. Some years you'll have, maybe it's 5 years, you'll have a good yield. It just really depends on a lot of different factors. But it's important to pay attention to the acorn drop because that's really going to dictate deer patterns. Once acorns start to drop and deer can start feeding inside the woods where they're a lot more safe and secure, particularly in areas where they experience a moderate to high amount of hunting pressure. So most public land instances, they're really going to shift from feeding in these open fields to feeding inside woodlands on acorns. In years where acorn production is low, that's when browsing becomes more important. And obviously, if cultivated crops are available, the lack of acorns does not pose a threat to survival. Illinois is basically a virtual buffet for the whitetail. So I saw we had a question from Jake and Becca asking about, you know, do they prefer certain types of acorns? That's a fantastic question and something we're going to discuss right now. And so essentially, instead of going over kind of species by species, what we're really going to do is just basically break it into two groups. So oak trees can be broken into two groups. We have the red oak group, and we also have the white oak group. Now, there are some physiological distinctions between the acorns, and this is really important to know as a hunter. I think a lot of hunters kind of neglect this information, is that deer prefer white oaks. White oaks do not have the content of tannic acid that the red oaks do, which kind of gives red oak their natural dark and red color. So they have a much sweeter and more mild taste. And so deer typically prefer white oaks, as do most wildlife species will prefer white oaks over red oaks. But there are a few things to keep in mind, particularly with white oaks. So white oaks, it will take an individual acorn 1 year to mature. A red oak, it will take 2 years for that acorn to mature. So essentially 2 growing seasons for that acorn to mature. Now the red oak is still going to produce acorns every year, but it is kind of producing them at that kind of odd interval. So you have every 2 years it's creating an acorn. what that does is kind of protect the, let's say the red oak crop from significant weather changes. Maybe you have a year with a drought that impacts acorn production. Well, that might really, really hamper the white oak production, make it almost non-existent, where the red oaks, they're still going to have that, that early growing year for the 2-year development. So there will still be a decent acorn crop out of the red oaks. So that's something to remember as well. But more importantly, white oaks are generally consumed quick. So there's not a lot of them out there as the season progresses. Another really important thing is due to the lack of tannin and tannic acid, they basically rot faster on the ground. So those white oak acorns that aren't ingested very, rather quickly, they're just going to rot, where the red oaks are going to remain a lot more edible and viable the longer on the ground. So how do you identify the difference between a red oak and a white oak? Red oaks, you can see in this graphic here on the left, you can see these oak leaves have very pointy lobes. So they, instead of being rounded, they're very pointy. And at the tip of that point, you kind of see this hair-like structure. That's what botanists call a bristle tip. So that is the red oaks. They will all have this bristle tip and typically pointed lobes, where the white oaks are all going to be somewhat rounded and they lack those bristle tips. And one more little piece of background information before we really dive into some of this content is pay attention to your wind. I know a lot of people who have success just kind of going into a stand without wind direction, but if it's an area that you have maybe a specific deer in mind, or it's on public land and there's a lot of pressure, it is imperative to control your wind. And I know there's a lot of different gadgets and different sprays that you can use, as well as cover scents and eliminators and ozone. But the most important thing is just playing the wind direction correctly. You can, remove a lot of the guesswork just by simply playing the correct wind. So essentially, I like to view it as I want to smell the deer. I don't want them to smell me. So I always want the wind typically blowing in your face, because you should be facing the way you expect the deer to be. But now with that, we're really going to dive into this kind of seasonal hunting approach. And we're going to start off basically October 1st, early October. What are we looking for? What are we focusing on? So that's where we're going to start. So if you have any questions as we move through this, feel free to utilize the chat. I am kind of watching it as much as I can. And if I don't happen to get to a question, Jason is there in the background, and he'll go ahead and answer that as he can. So early October, I typically focus on feeding areas and high traffic areas. So during this kind of early fall period, deer are beginning to shift to their natural fall patterns. They've been on this, what many people call as a summer pattern for the past few months. But the nice thing is, at this time of the year, deer are not as weary or as cautious of hunters. They've essentially had, 3 or 4 months of the woods to themselves for the most part. Nobody's bumping in their bedding area at 3 in the morning with flashlights, and nobody's hooting and hollering because they stuck a good one. It's just been kind of calm out there. So it's really important to kind of keep that in mind, that you're not hunting pressured deer at this point. So at this point, that's when I really focus on those predictable feeding patterns. And if you have trouble identifying feeding patterns, just get out and scout a little bit. And I know it's kind of easier said than done, but a lot of times, particularly trying to identify a doe bedding area, it can be as simple as taking a quick look at a satellite map and then just kind of going out to confirm it. But now that we're kind of getting into early October, the velvet is off of all the bucks, which basically signals a kind of physiological change in deer. The bucks, their testosterone levels are going to start to increase once that velvet sheath off of their antlers is completely gone. The antlers are going to harden and basically turn to a bone-like structure, and that's when their testosterone is going to start increasing. And that's going to cause bucks to start doing things a little bit differently. During the summer pattern, it's very common to see bachelor groups. So you might see 5 or 6 different, mature bucks all feeding in the same soybean field or in the same kind of woodlot area. But kind of early October, that's when things really start to change. Bucks are going to become solitary again. They're going to start identifying their kind of what we referred to earlier as that core range. They're really going to start narrowing that down. And that's when I really start my hunting activity. So I hunt fairly hard October 1st through October 5th. And then I might take some time off. But those first couple days of the season can be really productive because it's a good opportunity to catch either a mature buck or even a couple does off guard because they're still in that kind of early fall, late summer pattern. They're not too cautious yet. So it can be a really great time to hunt. Now, my go-to strategy for early October is basically focusing on what I call kind of a bed to feed pattern. It can also be reversed, kind of feed to bed, but for early October, I really like focusing on that bed to feed. And there's a few different ways you can go about it, but essentially the easiest way is to identify a bedding area, identify a feeding area, and then try to see what's between them. Now, in this particular example, this is what many people refer to as a pinch point or funnel. And if you focus on this map a little bit, for those who are familiar with topographic maps, you can see that we have this ridge kind of going diagonally down across this field. If right there, yep. So that's a ridge. And now for those who aren't familiar with topographic maps, the closer the lines are together, essentially the steeper that incline is going to be. So that's a fairly steep ridge, kind of right where the X is. And the nice thing is deer are fairly lazy. They don't like to go straight up a hill if they don't have to. So in this particular instance, it creates a nice funnel between that fairly tall ridge as well as the riverbank that kind of drops off 15 or 20 feet down there. So you have this really nice, basically pinch point where if they want to get from the bed to the food, they essentially have to either go a long way around or they're going to go the lazy natural way, which is basically right where you hopefully will be setting up. So doe to feed, or not doe to feed, but bed to feed pattern, particularly in early October, can be very effective. I wouldn't get, typically in early October, I'm going to be slightly closer to the food than I'm going to be towards the bedding area. Again, at this point in the season, hunting pressure is fairly low. And so I don't want to bump those deer out of that bedding area already. Typically, if you wait a week or two, somebody's probably going to do it for you anyway. But I like to, in the early season, before they really know the pressure's there, I'm going to stay off that bedding area and kind of leave it as kind of that sanctuary for just a little bit. And so I typically, on that bed to feed pattern, I'm going to be hunting more towards the feeding portion. And now we get into what a lot of hunters call the October lull. So this is kind of that mid-October. You have a lot of interesting things kind of happening during the October lull. You have that basically these deer start to realize that they're being hunted. They're getting bumped out of their beds. They're seeing different things start changing in nature. They're starting to hear people. And so they know what's going on. And so that's really going to impact how deer behave. So if basically it comes down to this. October lull can be difficult, but it can also be the hunt of a lifetime if you kind of use a lot of your tools to your advantage. And so if we think back to that previous example of early October, so you had this, basically the bed to feed pattern. Now you're going to have kind of the same pattern, but if you're hunting for does, I'm going to get a little bit closer to the bedding side of that, basically that travel range. Now, if you're focused on bucks, bucks are going to be somewhat nocturnal during the October lull. So they've started to know pressure is starting to basically increase, so they're not as daylight active. And that's why rut hunting is so important, is because basically they still know they're being hunted. They still, have basically this premonition to try to avoid predators, but they also have this nice thing called testosterone that is making them kind of do things that they typically won't do. They're not as cautious. And so that's why rut hunting is so important. But in this specific instance, I'm going to focus on staging areas. So this is ideally a buck targeted setup. Again, if you want to focus on does or just kind of fill the freezer during this time, still hunt that same kind of bed to feed situation, but try to skew a little bit closer to the bedding side of that equation. Because during this period, they typically are not going to enter the field until dark. And so if they typically pass you maybe 15 minutes before shooting light runs out, well, now everything's going to be pushed back. So you may have to get a little bit closer to their bedding area to make sure that when they pass you, it's still within the legal shooting light. But for a buck setup, you probably are familiar with the term staging. So a staging area is essentially a location just kind of outside the perimeter of a buck's bedding area where it's comfortable being in daylight. So a staging area in this example, now this specific example isn't necessarily kind of a hunting situation. I'm just trying to show what a potential staging area would look like, and then we can discuss how we might hunt it. So you can see this kind of corner, the shading area of the staging area. And so that's a real common staging area for a buck, is he can sit in that area, feel safe and secure, go about his way. He can still eat and drink in there, but he can also keep a keen eye on that field, whether it's for predator avoidance, whether it's looking for other does, whether it's looking for another buck to kind of torment or play with. These staging areas can be really advantageous. And typically it's, again, near a buck's bedding area, but within sight of some kind of doe feeding area. And I saw we had a question: do deer tend to bounce between different beds within an area, or different bedding areas, or both? Is it different between bucks and does? That's a great question. So typically bucks are going to use kind of the exact same area over and over. Again, they're very cautious about how they pick that individual bed. So typically there's some kind of blown down tree or blown down limb that they might kind of utilize as kind of the backing to the bed. Does, it's very common to just see does in kind of an area, and they might just bed anywhere within that kind of specific area. I don't think they're too picky about being in the exact bed that they were in before, as long as they're kind of in that area with their family group. That's what's really important to them. So the October lull, just again, focus on these staging areas for bucks. And if you're focused on does, that's when you can start to again, follow that bed to feed pattern, but try to be a little bit more on the bedding side. That can be extremely advantageous. And now this is when things start really heating up in the whitetail woods. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time basically covering, late October through kind of early December is what we'll call it. But we'll start off with kind of this late October. This is some of my favorite time to hunt. The majority of my success, particularly when trying to harvest mature older bucks, is either the day before or the day after Halloween. For some reason, that October 29th to November 1st is just really, really impactful in whitetail woods. So a lot of people kind of call this late October, early November period the seeking phase. So this is when you're going to have bucks. They're going to begin searching for does and heat. It's typically not going to be your older mature bucks. It's going to be a buck kind of like you see in this map or in this picture. It's going to be your younger bucks who really don't understand what's kind of happening to themselves right now and kind of why they're feeling the things they're feeling. So the younger bucks are very active chasing during this time. It can be a really good time to call in younger bucks as well. If you were to go out and rattle at this time of year in late October, I can almost assure you, you're going to have one or two of these little deer kind of come in and check out your rattle. So it can be a really good time to rattle for younger bucks. Older bucks really haven't started actively chasing, but what you're going to really start to pick up on while you're in the woods is the amount of rubs and scrapes that are going to begin to appear on the landscape. You're going to see rubs and scrapes basically everywhere you walk. But it's important to pay attention to where those are and where they are in kind of your overall knowledge of the deer movement in that area already. I see a lot of people who've hunted a particular area for, maybe several years, and all of a sudden they find a new scrape and they focus their entire season on that scrape, basically neglecting all the experience and all the knowledge that they've learned from that particular site over the years. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way to go about it, but to use that information. And so that this is when I start scouting again. I know a lot of people say, don't spend too much time scouting during the season. This time of year is drastically different than 3 weeks ago already. And so it is important to get out there and look over some of these sites and see if you find new rubs, see if you find maybe a new scrape line or new areas that just look promising. But the end of October, again, is crucial. When you start to see this is when you'll see the most rut sign. The buck's testosterone levels are starting to peak. They're not necessarily peaking just yet, but they're climbing rapidly. And the does are not ready to breed yet. And so this causes a little bit of frustration in bucks. And so this time of year, they might even take that out on each other. And so this is a really important time to try calling scenarios. Decoying, calling, and rattling are all extremely effective during this particular period. Now, me personally, I don't particularly do a lot of calling, and there's kind of two schools of thought on calling. You have what I kind of term it as blind calling. So this is kind of your rattling antlers, or if you're just sitting out in the woods and you just try a grunt. It's basically you don't necessarily see a deer, but you just want to try something because for some reason that specific setup isn't working right now, so you're just looking to try things out. Now, me personally, I don't do a lot of blind calling. I typically like to target my calling. So if I see a deer maybe kind of skirting away from me, that's when I might break out the call, but I don't typically just kind of blind call. But if you were to blind call, this would be a pretty good time of year to try that. And just be patient. Again, this time of year, things are going to rapidly change. So if you have a day where you're just not seeing activity, give it another day, and eventually it's going to turn around. So again, like I mentioned, one of my main strategies for hunting this time period is scouting. Now, I'm not going to go out and scout at prime time at 7 o'clock in the morning or an hour before sunset. What I'm really notorious for doing, what I really like to do this time of year is maybe hunt the morning, maybe get out of the stand about 10:30, and then just go walk around for an hour or two and see what happens. And maybe you come upon a spot that looks ideal for an evening setup. So that's what I really want to emphasize with this specific slide is just continually scout. Even if it's just while you're walking to and from your stand, just keep an eye out, pay attention to what you're seeing out there. And now if you do happen to find a rub line, late October is an excellent time to begin hunting over rub lines. So just some kind of basic background about rubs. They play a substantial role in communication. So essentially when a buck is rubbing on this with his antlers, he has several scent glands basically at the base of his antlers, and he's basically marking this area as his territory. And if you're ever out and you happen to find just a single rub, I would probably do a little bit more looking because typically you're going to find kind of what this bottom diagram really illustrates is a fairly easy to follow pathway of buck rubs. And the rubbing is going to remain throughout the breeding season. It's not something they just kind of one and done do. They're going to continually check these specific rubs and kind of redeposit that scent, but they also might make more. I saw a study put out by, I believe it was the University of Georgia last year, and they basically radio collared several wild whitetail. And I think they counted one deer, one specific buck in one rut season made over 400 individual rubs. And so that just kind of shows the totality of rubbing that is out there in the landscape. So use it to your advantage. It's going to give you, like we mentioned earlier with the buck bedding areas, this is going to, if you find a rub line, you are in that deer's core range. Where he spends a lot of his time is going to be somewhat near there. And so that's when you can really start to slow things down and start paying a little bit more attention and start planning. So if you do come across rubs, it might be a good idea to try hanging a trail camera just for a day or two. Not only does it tell you kind of what buck is making these rubs, but it also tells you the time of day. If he's making, working this specific rub line at 2 o'clock in the morning, I kind of want to know that before I decide and go sit on it for maybe a week straight. And so trail cameras can be really useful just to kind of confirm some of that and say, okay, this buck is walking by here, every couple days at 7 in the morning. So it's legal light. And so maybe that's worth setting up on. Another late October strategy that I personally like to use is hunting over scrapes. Now, when people kind of get, I think a lot of hunters get kind of the wrong idea of scrapes. And I remember back in the day, I read a Buckmaster article, and they were saying, oh, a buck is going to check it every 12 hours, blah blah blah. Go sit, go sit, go sit. And what a lot of the research has shown in the past decade or past couple decades is that bucks are really going to only kind of utilize these scrapes typically between 2 and 3 in the morning. There is still that kind of small percent of daytime scrape visitation, but the majority of the activity on that particular scrape by a buck, particularly a mature buck, is going to be basically at night. So don't put all your eggs in a basket. If you see a scrape, it's a good sign, but it doesn't necessarily need to change your overall hunting strategy. But it can. So one thing that can be really advantageous to do if you happen to find a scrape is maybe utilize some different lures. So basically a buck is going to make this, and he is going to urinate in the scrape. So he's going to paw off all the vegetation, and he's going to urinate in it. And when he urinates, he's going to urinate down his legs, and basically inside right at the kneecap, he's got 2 tarsal glands. And these tarsal glands are going to deposit more pheromone onto that urine, and it's going to then deposit on the ground. And so the theory is that then does are going to come by and say, okay, there's a mature buck here. And when a doe is in estrus and she's ready to breed, she's going to come to the scrape. She's going to urinate in it. And that's going to let the buck know that now she's in estrus. And then he's going to begin scenting her. So you can use this as a strategy to basically entice a buck. So if you find his scrape, you can go ahead and go into the scrape and basically mimic what a doe would do. So maybe take a few drops of a doe estrus lure, drop a few in there, and then maybe tie a piece of cotton to a string and just put a few more drops on that and just tie it to your boot and walk to a new stand. Very often, we actually had a quick story. We had a colleague who came over from from UK, so in Europe, last deer season. Never hunted whitetail, and he kind of saw this tactic in a magazine, and he was really engulfed in the idea of hunting this way and really wanted to try it. He filled his 2 buck tags within 4 days doing this method. So it can be very effective, and if you do happen to find a scrape, it's definitely worth a try. I personally don't like to sit over a scrape, but I like to utilize that scrape in kind of my hunt plan. Now, if you are going to focus on scrapes, there's a few different types of scrapes to keep in mind. You have kind of what a lot of people call a primary scrape. Some people will call it a signpost scrape, community scrape. I think I've heard a few other people refer to. But essentially, these are bigger scrapes that are typically utilized by multiple deer at the same time. Typically, it's going to contain a licking branch, like you can see this particular buck interacting with. The mature buck is going to rub the licking branch and basically, again, secrete pheromones that are located in glands on his forehead at the base of the antlers, and he's going to deposit that on the branch. What I'm looking for when I first come across a scrape is I'm looking for that licking branch. I'm making sure there actually is a branch there. Typically, it will be kind of broken or kind of mangled just from the way he's interacting with it. But I'm also looking for the size of the scrape, as well as kind of the consistency of it. Is there leaves starting to kind of overtake the scrape, or is it fresh and bare? Because that's going to let you know that it's still active, or something that was just kind of a one and done scrape that's maybe not being attended to very often. So I want those scrapes that just look like, that it kind of looks like a wild hog was just out there kind of mulling and rolling around. It's just a big mud pit. You can see the tracks dragging through it. Those are the scrapes that I look for when I'm trying kind of this drag lure setup. So scrapes can be important, but I wouldn't sit over the scrape, but I would use that scrape in your kind of your planning process. So here's kind of my sample in late October, early November. This is kind of my go-to. If I don't have maybe eyes on a particular buck that I have kind of figured out his daytime activity, this is kind of a really go-to strategy for trying to harvest a mature or even a young buck during late October or early November. First, you want to identify, again, that doe bedding area. And I keep emphasizing doe bedding areas, but I think they're really overlooked by a lot of whitetail hunters. A lot of whitetail hunters focus on bedded, bedding areas for bucks. But remember, come this time of year, where the buck's going to be, they're going to try to be where the does are. And so doe bedding areas this time of year are really effective at bringing in multiple different bucks to a specific area, particularly on the downwind side. So you can see in this example, basically, this is the example buck trail. So during this time, he's going to be basically cruising and searching for does in estrus. And so he's going to try to cover areas that he can get his nose on as many does as he can. And bedding areas and feeding areas are really effective ways of doing that. And so getting on the downwind side of a bedding area is very effective this time of year. But I also want to point out something really important to keep in mind. So in this specific example, and this is kind of a hunting area I've used over the years, and I had good success in this area, but you'll notice, again, there's a really steep ridge kind of right off the southern side of this doe bedding area. And again, that's going to act as that kind of same funnel or pinch point from that example earlier. And so this is a really good example where the deer only, has maybe 50 yards to walk between the doe bedding area and that high ridge. And, during this time of year, if he gets on the high ridge, chances are he's not going to be able to get a good wind smell on the bedding area. So he's going to want to be and hang down that bottom a little bit. So it's a really good kind of funnel to essentially funnel that deer between you and this valley that drops off in here. So my X, if you were to set up, that's the nice thing about situations like this. You basically have anywhere kind of on the southern half of that bedding area, you can set up and have a very good chance of harvesting a buck with the right wind. So if this wind were to shift to north, then obviously you want to switch to the other side of the bedding area. But what I really want to highlight here is just using the doe bedding area as kind of your own scent, your own lure out there. There's not going to be many does in estrus, so bucks they're not just going to, check one bedding area and be done. They're going to check multiple, and they're going to check check an individual bedding area multiple times. And so in this specific example, anywhere you set up, on this southern half of the bedding area in the woods, you'll have a really good chance at catching that cruising buck as he starts to kind of maneuver downwind of that bedding area. And now this is an example of kind of an evening hunt. Now, if we want to do a morning hunt, I would kind of do it the exact same way, but I would be hunting over a feeding area, hunting on the downwind side of a feeding area. So typically, deer are going to be feeding at night and bedded during the day. So in the morning, typically you're hunting a feed to bed pattern, where in the evening, you're typically hunting a bed to feed pattern. And yes, this PowerPoint will be available for download to reference. Matt. So now this is when things kind of break out of their shell, and this is when the whitetail woods turn into something special. This is what most people know and call peak rut. So this is when, if you were to take, maybe a week or two out of work to deer hunt, this would be a pretty good time to try that. But I'm typically going to call this kind of the chasing phase. So this is when the big bucks are really going to be active and chasing. So if we think back to late October, That's kind of the seeking phase. So they're still seeking out where these does are and seeking out that first doe in estrus. Now the does are in estrus and the bucks are chasing them. So bucks, again, they're going to be focused on one specific thing, and that's breeding. If you have one of the first does in a specific area, it can be a really advantageous thing because that first doe that comes in estrus, she's going to bring bucks from almost all over the county, it seems like sometimes. But you'll see deer you've never seen before. You'll see bucks you've never seen before, and it's all because you have that one doe in heat. So early November, that's what I'm focused on, is trying to find where those does and heats are, and then where is the buck going to kind of chase that doe to. So a lot of my same tactics kind of follow along the same trend. Is I'm going to hunt on the downwind side of bedding areas because the bucks are still going to be seeking, but if they happen to find a specific doe that's in estrus, that's when he's going to start chasing her. And that's when it gets really difficult to kind of near impossible to predict where a deer is going to go. I remember a hunt 3 or 4 years ago. It was about 9 o'clock in the morning. I had a doe come running by, and 2 minutes later, a buck came running by, and they must have ran circles around me for 2.5 to 3 hours before they finally gave up and just bedded down together. And so it can be really hard to predict where those bucks are once they find a doe. So I'm still focused on the rest of the does. I'm not focused on the does that are already being chased. I'm focused on what's still available for bucks to try to breed. So my preferred approach, again, hunt the does. Bedding area, set up along the downwind side. Feeding area, same as well. And yes, just like Jason mentioned, bucks do neglect their feeding during this time. Food sources are useful, but they're useful for hunting does. But remember, I hunt does during the rut because where the buck's going to be, they're going to be where the does are. So food sources are still important, but don't expect the buck to enter that food source with the desire to actually feed. He's going to be there to harass and to find a doe in estrus. He's not there to feed, but the does will still be actively feeding during this time. Yes. So this is when the buck's testosterone is peaking. It's going to be about as high as it's ever been and as high as it's going to be. And it can get tough to hunt this time as you kind of transition to the next phase of rut, which I call the tending phase. But that's what a lot of people kind of call it, the locked up phase. And so that's when a buck is bedded with an individual doe and he's tending her. He might be with her for 24 to 48 hours. So if you think about that happening on kind of a large scale in the whitetail woods, it kind of takes a lot of the deer, not necessarily out of the population, but kind of out of the huntable population, because they're just off in these thicket areas. They're not moving much. They're not feeding. They're not drinking. They're just breeding. And so it can be challenging at this point in the season. But what I would focus on is focus on that downwind side of a doe bedding area. Because even after a buck goes and breeds one doe, he's immediately going to start looking for another doe once she decides she's basically had enough of him. There is instances where they'll kind of hang around maybe for a few hours after they finish breeding, but eventually she's going to basically push him away, and that's when he's going to go on and try to search for another doe. So try to key in on the doe bedding areas. And the doe bedding areas will probably differ from where they were in early October. The vegetation is going to be changing, wind direction, climate. So that's in kind of peak rut, focus on prairie grasses for doe bedding areas. Once you get a cold front, they really prefer to bed in kind of taller grasses rather than just kind of out in the woodlands. So I really like hunting near kind of prairie grass fields or tall grass prairies, or even just kind of an overgrown field that's kind of just coming up with goldenrod and different thickets and shrubs out there. Those can all be really good areas to focus on for these does. So here is kind of an example of a rattling setup. So rattling can be extremely effective anywhere from early October to kind of mid-November. Now, personally, I don't typically like to rattle too much after kind of the first week in November. After that, that's when a lot of hunters are out in the woods and they get called at a lot. And so deer start to pick up on these things. And so a lot of times later in rut and later in the season, a lot of times just concealing yourself can be a lot better than kind of giving away your presence. And so this is kind of a quick example of a rattling setup, or how I would set up in a rattling scenario. So this is not just kind of me going out and setting up in a specific spot and deciding to rattle. This is me saying, I think I want to try to rattle, and this is the place to do it. So we have kind of this rub line on the top right. And what does a rub line mean? Again, it essentially means that you are in that buck's core area. So the chances of him hearing you are somewhat high, unless, of course, he's off chasing a doe, and then who knows. But again, this time of year, there's bucks moving all over. And so rattling can be really effective at trying to draw those in. Now, when you rattle, there's a few things to keep in mind. One of the biggest things is that deer like to circle downwind when they decide they want to investigate something. Maybe you're rattling, or maybe you do a grunt call. Typically, they like to get downwind so that they can try to smell where that individual deer is and who that individual deer is. And so that's why rattling can be really good this time of year, because you can use that kind of technique against themselves. So in this particular example, you can see we have basically kind of a lower bottom field that's surrounded by a decent sized ridge top. And so in this scenario, I'm going to be where the X is, and I'm going to be facing east. And so that you can see how close those contour lines are behind me together. And that makes that a very steep ridge. And the chances of a deer trying to sneak that way and try to come up or kind of sneak in behind there are fairly low, when he can just enter that field near his rub line or in any other way that can hopefully kind of bring him in there in a much easier way. And so this is when I like to mix in multiple calls together. I see a lot of hunters and hear a lot of hunters in the woods who will just kind of bang antlers together, maybe 2 or 3 times, and that's kind of it. And while that can be effective, what I like to kind of prefer and to preach is make that scenario sound as realistic as possible. If there's two 200-pound mammals clashing their bony heads together out there, it's going to make some noise. They're also not just going to be hitting antlers. They're going to be grunting. They're going to be wheezing. And so typically for a rattling setup, even if I'm bow hunting, I prefer to be on the ground. It gives me the ability to smack some vegetation, to kind of stomp my foot on the ground, to rake some limbs, rake some twigs and branches, just to make it sound like there's this huge scuffle going on out there. And it just makes that whole scenario look a little bit more realistic. And hopefully any approaching buck is going to try to circle downwind, but hopefully he gets caught by that ridge, and hopefully that kind of puts him right in my sweet spot. Now, I have actually hunted this particular field and had the exact opposite happen. So I was set up basically right where the X is, just a little bit closer to the very crest of that ridge, and I had a buck sneak in behind me. So it does happen, but in this scenario, the nice thing is, since you're so elevated, if he's coming along that bottom, a lot of times that scent is just blowing straight over the top of his head, and he's not picking up on it because it's not funneling down into that valley. It's just kind of sailing straight over his head. And so that kind of made it reasonable that I could still hunt, the odd wind there. And so I had a buck come up behind me, got into, 20 or 30 yards, and never heard me. I didn't end up getting a shot, but it still just goes to show that you can do all this planning, but then things like that happen. But this situation was advantageous for that, just because I was up on this high ridge, and it allowed those scent molecules to just kind of zoom over the top of his head, and he had no worse for wear, and never knew I was there. So this same setup can be used for a decoy. Now, I personally don't spend too much time hunting, using deer decoys in my deer hunting, but I know people do like to use them, so I just wanted to bring it up. This is kind of another ideal situation for it. Now, if I was using a decoy here, I probably wouldn't rattle too much. I would certainly call, but I don't know that I would necessarily rattle. And I'll explain that in just a few minutes. But what I really want to focus on is you want to try to get that decoy as close to the buck's core range as you can, reasonably, without blowing him out of there, without disturbing it, making too much noise, depositing too much of your human scent. And get that decoy in an area that it can be seen. And so the really nice thing about a field like this is that it's, again, surrounded basically on all sides by a fairly high ridge. So if there happens to be a buck on the opposite side of the ridge and you start calling, and then he just kind of peeks his head over the ridge, looks down in that field, well, then he instantly sees what he expected based on what he hears. And so that can be really intriguing for deer. It just, takes that last little bit of doubt in them away. And so decoys can be really good at just pulling that deer in a little bit closer, or making a cautious deer a little bit more comfortable in a specific setup. Now, you do need to remember a few things when you are using a decoy. Again, be safe. I do not recommend using a decoy on public land, particularly during firearm season. I do not recommend that. Archery season, I think you could probably get away with, but use your best judgment and be safe. If when you're carrying your deer out, make sure to dismantle it, maybe wrap it in a big orange towel or blanket, just to let everybody know this is a decoy, this isn't a real deer. Another thing that's important to do is to make sure you basically either reduce or ideally eliminate all of kind of the residual human scent on the decoy. When you go out there and start putting it together, you're going to deposit oils and different things on your hand, from your hands onto the decoy, and the deer are going to pick that up. And so using some of these scent eliminator sprays can be good. Just try to reduce that as much as possible. I also, if I were to use a decoy, I would also try to use a lure with it, a scent lure, probably just a buck urine. It doesn't need to be doe and estrus. It just needs to be something to add to the whole realism of that individual scenario. And we have a question from Matt. Would you use the same setup at evening with falling thermals? Fantastic question, and I'm glad you brought that up. I meant to and I forgot. And that is why this specific spot worked so well for that example where the deer snuck in behind me. So for those who aren't familiar, we basically have thermals. The earth is obviously warmed by the sun. And so in the morning, you have these rising columns of warm air. And that also has the ability to grab your scent molecules and take it up into the stratosphere as well. In the evening, as temperatures start to cool, you basically have the reverse effect. So you have these falling thermals that kind of sink all your scent molecules and all this moisture down to the ground. And so that's why in this specific scenario, if that deer had snuck up behind me in an evening sit, chances are, like Matt mentioned, my thermals would have probably snuck and just fell right down to him. And I probably would have never seen him. He would have just never appeared. He would have smelled me, from several hundred yards off. And so it is important to pay attention to that. In the morning, a lot of people say hunt the ridges because that rising column. So if you're in the morning hunting the bottom and you're hunting, let's say, kind of at the bottom side of a ridge, and that scent is just going right up that ridge. And so anything on the ridge is going to get your scent, where in the evening, all that settles down. So great question, Matt. So early November, this is what I would call a typical rut setup, particularly if you're not interested in trying an overly aggressive approach. The two kind of we just discussed, kind of the calling scenario as well as the decoy scenario, are fairly aggressive tactics and not something I recommend, early on in rut. That might be something to try, as you get towards kind of mid to late November. But this is a really good strategy for being non-aggressive and for not blowing an entire doe bedding area out. So I'm going to hunt, again, the downwind side of a feeding area. I know it sounds like we're kind of mentioning these things a lot, but hunting big bucks, that's what a lot of it is focusing on the downwind side of a buck bedding area, or of a doe bedding area or a doe feeding area. So again, you want to hunt where you expect those does to be. What I like to do is to set up along trails that run parallel to food sources. So typically, kind of like we mentioned earlier, that these bucks like to stage. before they enter a field. Does will start to do that as well later on in the season as they notice pressure. And so typically there's going to be fairly utilized trails that kind of run parallel to the feeding area. And that just gives them the ability to kind of walk down and check out the entirety of that feeding area before they enter the field. I'm sure we've all seen it. You're sitting in this field and you just see this little head poking out of the woods. And it sits there, maybe 15, 20 minutes sometimes, just staring at this field, making sure it's safe and secure. And so you can utilize some of these trails to your advantage, because who's gonna follow along those trails in rut? The buck is. And so it can be a really good time to hunt parallel trails to feeding areas that are on the downwind side. Now, as we move progressively through November, this is when things start to slow down a little bit. This is when it can be frustrating as a whitetail hunter. You've just been through this kind of ethereal 2-week period of just nonstop action of deer running around like rabbits and seeing all these unique behaviors. And then you get to this phase where it just seems like everything's gone. And it can be difficult, because this is when active breeding is occurring. So this is what I call as the tending phase. So this is when the bucks are going to be tending a doe. And it can be fairly difficult to hunt just because they're not covering a large swath of area. So this time of year, you want to focus on trying, what I like to say is, get in the bedroom. So you want to be in that thicket that these deer are basically tending. And those are typically kind of thickets that are adjacent to a doe bedding area. And so this is just kind of an example of where I found 2 breeding bucks several years ago. So that you can see this entire field is kind of overgrown. The trees are starting to take back over. It's not a healthy stand of prairie grasses. There's still a few prairie grasses out there, but it's really just becoming this kind of old, gnarly field. And it's a very frequently used doe bedding area. And kind of off to the northeast corner of this field, you kind of see this really thick kind of overgrowth of cedar thickets, as well as honey locust. And there's a lot of blackberry and different green briars. And it's just this nasty, thick patch. And those are the areas you're looking for. Areas that if you tried to walk through, you're going to come out looking like ground beef by the end of it, because you're going to be so cut up with thorns and stuff. They want the thickest cover they can find this time of year. Now, what happens to does is they breed. So we're just going to kind of give a quick overview of kind of the behavior of the does. So does are typically going to show signs of estrus fairly prematurely. And so the bucks are going to start to chase and attempt to breed a doe about 24 hours before she is physically receptive to breed. And so that's why that chasing phase can be so exciting, is you have all these bucks, chasing estrus does that aren't even ready to breed yet, but the bucks think they are. And so it just leads to this kind of interesting relationship between males and females, really. But the buck is going to be, following her for 24 hours. And sometimes he will do the same thing after she leaves estrus. She's still going to have some kind of residual estrus. And so he's typically going to stay around because he still thinks she's receptive to breed. Once the buck departs, the doe is going to start regrouping with her family group. And she's going to join back up into that group that she beds with, that she feeds with, and that she spends time with. Now the buck, once he finds an estrus doe, he's going to do anything to defend her from any other bucks that are trying to breed her. And that's why before this phase, so early November, rattling can be really useful, because it basically simulates there's a buck with a hot doe here, with a doe in estrus or in heat, and there's 2 bucks that are fighting over her. Well, I think I'm the dominant buck, so I'm going to go join and see if I can take over these 2 bucks and claim that doe for myself. And that's why it can be really exciting that time of year. But once the bulk of the does enter estrus, the deer begin to pair off. So the bucks are going to feed and bed and basically spend all their time with that single doe that is receptive to breed. Again, they're going to be in very thick cover, and he will breed the specific female basically as many times as she will allow. Sometimes it's upwards of 10 to 12 times during that estrus cycle. And then after breeding, they're going to start to go back to normal. The buck is going to depart, and he is going to begin instantly searching for another doe to breed. They're not going to go feed. They're not going to go rest too much. They're not going to go drink. They're going to start seeking and chasing more does. And so setting up in funnels and pinch points can also be advantageous this time of year. Kind of the same concept applies, just kind of the downwind side of that bedding area. Because bucks are still going to be out there searching for does. It's just that the bulk of the does have already entered or finished their estrus cycle. And so it can, basically numbers are not on your side if you do hunt that way. But hunting kind of thickets adjacent to doe bedding areas can be productive. Now, myself personally, I've only witnessed a buck tending a doe one time in almost 20 years of deer hunting. So it's not something that you see frequently. And again, that's because they're finding deer know areas that people don't go in. They know where people stay out of, and then that's where they're going to go. Now, as we move through December, this is when we have kind of what many people call a second rut. So late November, things are starting to calm down. Rut is starting to dwindle. The does are back in their family groups. They're starting their normal feeding, their bed to feed patterns, and then feed back to bed patterns. And the bucks are still kind of doing their own thing. But this is when the bucks start to really try to put on as much weight as possible, especially in early December. Again, they've lost a lot of body weight. So this, from December through January, they're trying to put as much fat reserves on as they can to try to make it through the winter. But during early December, we do have a second rut, and it's essentially 28 days after the standard first estrus cycle. It is a much lower activity level rut than the first rut. A lot of years you won't really notice second rut is occurring unless you're out there a lot, just because the activity is not near as high as it is during that first rut. Doe fawns, if they're above kind of a certain weight, so it comes down to body condition, but you can kind of correlate it to weight. Once doe fawns get to a certain size, they can become sexually reproductive and sexually mature. And at that point, if it is before the second rut, they will also come into estrus, but they can also come into estrus basically throughout December. So late November, early December, I'm really focusing on bed to feed patterns.
Hey, Dan. Jake and Becca asked a question there where they're asking, are they seeking new does within the same doe group around their bedding area, or do they move on to new areas?
That's a great question. They will kind of do whatever the deer herd dictates. I think, first of all, they're going to check kind of their normal doe bedding areas that they frequent that are somewhat within their core range or adjacent to their core range. And a lot of research has shown that outside of this, not outside, but inside this kind of 2-week period, if a buck doesn't find a receptive doe, he's going to start traveling. Sometimes it might be a mile or 2 miles as he starts venturing. Normally, especially in Illinois, our deer population's high enough that they don't have to travel that far to find a receptive doe. So typically they're not going to focus on, totally new areas unless they kind of search all their old, let's call it stomping grounds, and they don't find another doe in estrus that is not actively being tended to. When they travel, do they return to their existing bed or abandon it? Another really great question. So it really depends on that specific animal. So typically a buck is going to return to that core range. It might not be the rest of that deer season. It might be come summer. He rejoins up with his original bachelor group and goes that way. But typically he is going to want to return to his core range. So you can expect him to utilize kind of those same existing beds that he's had. Now remember, a buck typically doesn't have an individual bed. They're going to have multiple beds. And so just because you don't see a buck, utilizing a specific bed, it doesn't mean he's still not in that range. He might just be using a different bed for the day. We have a question from Ryan. If there are active people on a farm, will deer behavior thrown off? Doe bedding change, will they completely leave? Will they completely, who don't, basically, will they completely leave the area? Normal farm activity doesn't seem to be a huge factor for deer activity. Now, if what I've noticed is if you're walking through the woods at 4 o'clock in the morning with a flashlight, that's going to spook a deer. If you're driving a four-wheeler, at 10 o'clock in the afternoon or at noon, they know what those sounds are, especially if it's an active farm. They're used to hearing mechanical noises and engines, and they're probably used to people being somewhat active in the woods. And that's why I think public land gets kind of a bad rap at times. And I think this will help clarify a little bit, Ryan, is that there's a lot of pressure on public land, but it's also consistent pressure. At some point, those deer don't necessarily get familiar or used to it, but it certainly doesn't impact them the way that I think it would. So I think it can affect the deer hunting on a specific farm, but I think it really depends on the size of the herd and the available habitat that's there. If they feel safe enough in that area, if they have enough bedding areas, if they have enough cover and enough thick cover, I think they'll hang around and stay safe there. But if the habitat quality isn't, basically, let's just say, isn't up to snuff, so to speak, and there's not much, thick vegetative cover, I think they might start venturing off to new areas. But other than that, I don't think normal farm activity interacts too much with deer hunting. It's when you try to sneak through the woods that deer become really receptive. I know a guy in college who would actually take a weed eater to his tree stand and just kind of use it as he walked in, just to make it sound like they're just some normal farm maintenance. And he had great success with it. I mean, I would personally never try it. People try anything for deer hunting, but I think it just goes to show that it's really dependent on the habitat as well as the deer herd and kind of the activity level. So now we'll kind of move into, we'll call this late season. So this is kind of, after that second rut to the end of deer season. So, January 20th. This is when deer hunting gets hard. It can be tough, but it can also be very rewarding and very productive. This time of year, if you find 1 or 2 deer, you are not likely going to see just 1 or 2 deer. You're likely to see 2 dozen, 3 dozen. They really group up at this time of year, and it's not just doe groups. It's basically all groups. Deer just come together this time of year, and that's because of one thing: it's food. They have the impending winter looming over their heads. They've had a rough rut. They've exhausted. They've lost a lot of weight, so they need to start packing on those fat reserves, and so they're going to be feeding very heavily. But as we kind of mentioned, there's going to be a lot less food on the landscape as well. The crops are going to be harvested. The acorns, particularly the white oaks, they're all going to be consumed or at this point rotten. The red oak acorn crop will still be around, and deer will actively dig through the snow to find red oak acorns. But so that's what you want to focus on this time of year, is find those kind of mega food sources. So you want to focus. I'll give a quick preamble. So it's really easy to find food sources this time of year, particularly in Illinois, because we typically get fairly regular snow events, between Christmas and January 20th. And really, if you just get 1 or 2 snow events, you can use that to basically fill a tag rather quickly. And what I really like about snow is obviously it's going to tell you up-to-date information. But what's really important this time of year is you're going to be able to identify feeding areas that are in the woods. And so a lot of times that can be fairly difficult throughout the year, because you have kind of acorn crops. They just drop everywhere. There's oak. I mean, Illinois is just a giant oak woods in a lot of places. But when deer activity, when they actively feed in a specific area, especially looking at kind of a red oak flat in the snow, it's going to look like a football field was played out there. So my strategy for late season is I'm going to walk around. I'm going to try to find a single pair of tracks, especially in the fresh snow, and I'm going to follow those tracks until I find that big bedding area or that big feeding area. And if I don't, I'll go find another set of tracks, and I will just continually do that and do that and do that. Especially this time of year, deer have been through several firearm seasons. They've been through the majority of archery season. I don't think you can do too much to pressure deer at this point. Now, an older mature buck, you could very well bump him out of the area for the rest of the season. But if you're just looking to harvest does, or maybe a mature buck isn't something that you're necessarily focused on, but get out and scout this time of year and find those kind of mega food sources. Now, afternoon hunts are king this time of year. I personally, I don't hunt mornings during the late season. I know very few hunters who do. Particularly it's cold, but more importantly, the activity of deer and the deer behavior at this point really lends itself to afternoon sits. Midday hunts can also be extremely productive. So if you have a changing weather pattern, so let's say we had 5 days of really cold weather, and then we had 1 or 2 nice warm days. Those 1 or 2 warm days, I would be out in the woods, those afternoons and evenings. Changing weather patterns really kicks deer activity into kind of the next gear. So focus on changing weather patterns. South-facing slopes can be extremely productive for bedded deer because south-facing slopes get a lot more sun than the north face, and so they're going to be a little bit warmer. But those south-facing slopes also protect deer from those cold northerly winds that are coming down. So they're going to be bedded on the southern sides of south-facing slopes, essentially, especially on really, really frigid and cold days. Now with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jason for a few minutes, and he's going to run us through a quick scenario.
Thanks a lot, Dan. So this is a map that was put together by Engineered Pursuit. If you're not familiar with it and you want to go find some public land sites, this might be very helpful to you. So at the DNR website, when you look up public land sites, they give you a regional map, which are similar to these color patterns that they put here with the pins. And you can click on that regional map, and then that'll give you an A to Z list of the public lands within that region. So these guys took it and they made a Google Earth map with it, and they put pins. Each public site is located, and then when you click on the pin, it takes you to the DNR website and gives you the hunter fact sheet, so that way you can look at what hunting is allowed there. So the URL is down here, and again, we'll be giving you guys the PowerPoint so you can use that to help find this map, and it's very useful to help you kind of see what sites are in an area, and instead of just looking at an A to Z alphabetized list there. So say you went on there and then you found an area that you were interested in hunting in, and you were looking to see what information you find about that. So the DNR does provide some really useful information. So one is the public land hunting report. So you can use this to look at whatever site you've clicked on and see information such as the total hunting acres at that site, the total hunting trips that went to that site, so you can see how heavily hunted it was. You can see the different species taken from the site from the previous year. So this will allow you to see if there is an abundance of the species or game that you're going after at each of these sites, and then also give you an idea of how heavily hunted that is. So using this information, we're going to look at moraine view here, which is highlighted in yellow. So you can kind of see that it's a decent sized site. It's over 1,000 acres for huntable land. And you can see that 27 deer were taken off of there with bow, nothing in rifle season. So in bow, they had 27 taken off there. So using this information, you can calculate and kind of rank. If you have multiple sites that you're interested in looking at, you can use these type of calculations to help you kind of rank and make sense of the numbers. So you can calculate harvest per acreage, deer harvest versus huntable acreage. You can calculate harvest per effort and deer harvest versus total hunting trips taken. You can also calculate effort per acre and total hunting trips versus huntable acres. So that can just give you an idea to kind of rank it and see which one of these gives you the most bang for your buck and might not be as competitive to try to get a tag for that place. So it helps you kind of understand how to rank these areas if you're looking into trying to figure out where to go. Then moving on, you can also have the hunter fact sheet. So these are very important for hunting public land in Illinois. Almost every public land has its own regulations that you need to look up, and these are found on the hunter fact sheet. So these will give you the information on what type of species are allowed to be hunted there, the seasons that they're open for, and the hours that they're open for. And it will also let you know if you need to check in or check out at that location. And also if you need to get a free windshield card, which many of these sites do require. And those you would fill out and return before February 15th. If you do not return it by February 15th, you are not eligible to hunt at that location on the following year. And even if you don't get anything, you need to return that windshield card. So they want to know how many, like that's how they got all that information with the hunting report, to see how many trips people took out there and all that. So that helps them compile that information for other hunters to use to make their decision on where they want to go. And then also you might have sign in and sign out, depending on the site as well. So all things to keep in mind as you're going to these public land sites. So again, we're looking at moraine view. And you can see here, this is the map that's provided through the hunter fact sheet. It has a link at that site that will take you to a map. Some maps are better than others. Talking to the DNR, they are working on upgrading all of the maps and the online experience. And so they're trying to come out with a new website here soon, hopefully in the coming year. And so this is a pretty decent map compared to some other maps. Some other maps, like I would say they're kind of like a campground map or something like that, where they're kind of very vague and give you an idea of the areas. But this one gives you the satellite view. So you can see where no hunting is allowed in the red, and then you can see where hunting is allowed. And it gives you the different parking locations that are in these blue squares here, and they're numbered. And so you look at this map and you kind of see where is some decent location at that you'd be interested in going hunting. And another statistic that's interesting is that hunters tend to only go about a quarter mile away from the parking lot. So by looking at that, you can kind of, okay, I don't want to be anywhere around here or around here, and try to stay away from the parking lots and see where you can walk in at, where the deer may not be as pressured as they might be if they're closer to the parking lot. So this is using OnX Hunt is this map layer, but you can use this on Google Earth if you'd like, or any other type of free mapping software. So we mapped out where all the different parking lots are at and where the check-in station was at for the park office. And then you can put layers on there with where you're interested in going and scouting at. So you can see that trying to stay away from that parking lot, we were interested in looking around these areas and then into these timbers down here. Possibly this field up here might be a decent one that's kind of far enough away from these parking lots that you might not be too pressured up in there. So some things to consider as you're going to the site. So you're going to want to know your entry and exit points, and then also consider those points with the wind directions. That way you're not blown out of location on your way in. And you might want to have several locations at each site. So that way, if the wind's blowing a different direction each day, you have that opportunity to go where you're going to be downwind, no matter which location you choose. You're going to want to note what gear you're going to need before you head on out. So are you hunting in a tree stand? Or are you going to take a blind out with you? Are you hunting on the ground? And then also, if they allow create shooting lanes, if you're on public property, you're not allowed to create shooting lanes or damage the vegetation at all. So you can't do that. But if you're on private land, you can go out and prepare your sites by making the shooting lanes up. And you can also note hunter sign. So looking to see if other hunters are in your area and try to distance yourself away from them as you're able to on these public land sites. So now we're going to have an interactive example. So we're going to have a question pop up and you guys are going to let us know where you guys would put a tree stand at. So the example is that it's November 5th. There's 7-mile-an-hour winds coming from the northeast. And your goal is to figure out where the stand location is going to be at on this satellite view. So again, the wind's coming out of the northeast, and then you have your bedding areas and your feeding areas. And then I think Dan is going to discuss a little bit more.
Yeah, can you go ahead and advance to the next slide? Perfect. So we have 4 choices for this specific example. So I'm going to pop up a poll and it should launch on your device. If you're on a mobile device, it should be at the top, and you can kind of move it around to go back to the question and kind of review. You can submit multiple answers for this specific question, so feel free to do so. But remember to pay attention to that wind direction. And we'll give it about 20 more seconds, and then we'll go ahead and close out. Okay, I know not everyone's probably got a chance to vote yet, but it looks like about 66% have voted, so we'll go ahead and end it. And I will share the results, and hopefully you guys can all see on your screen what the results are. So it looks like most people chose D and B, correct. So you can hunt either D or B, and we will kind of go over scenarios. So Jason, if you want to go ahead and, I will go ahead and say this. In this specific example, A and C will be very difficult to hunt with the way the wind direction is. If you look at this arrow in the top left, if you were to sit in either A or C, all your scent is basically going to blow directly into that bedding area, and it's going to blow it out. The deer are going to instantly know you're there, and they probably won't be back to that bedding area for a few days. But first, we'll discuss B. So B is a very good option, particularly because you have this doe bedding area. And again, this is kind of that early November, so there's a lot of rutting activity happening this time of year. So those bucks are going to be searching that downwind side. And the nice thing is you again have this nice natural funnel. So you have this ridge, which makes this option where D was very intriguing. But if it's, let's say, again, it's November 5th, so let's say it's an evening hunt. And maybe the deer are starting to be pressured and you notice they don't enter the feeding area until it's after dark. That's when I would prefer to set up over kind of where B is, just because it gets me a little closer to the bedding. So when they happen to get out of the bedding to leave, to the feeding area, I'm in range. Because if the does are already in a feeding area, the buck's not going to come to it. If the bucks are in a feed, or if the does are in a feeding area, he is not going to come to this bedding area. But in this example, he does, just because he happens to walk right by it. But I would prefer, in this specific example, to hunt near the feeding area, and I'll discuss why in just a second. So this is a really good location because not only are you getting the downwind side of that feeding area covered, you're getting the downwind side of the bedding area covered, but you're also covering the potential where you would expect the does to go from bedding to feeding. You're also covering that specific lane. You're covering the downwind side of that lane too. And so this is a really good example of what my typical kind of rut setup looks like if I don't have particular eyes on a specific deer, or I haven't patterned a specific buck yet. This is kind of the scenario I'm looking for. I'm going to try to get a bedding area and a feeding area that are somewhat close together, and I'm going to try to get smack dab in the middle and try to get on that downwind side. Because the nice thing about this is if it's a really slow day and you decide I'm just going to go ahead and fill a doe tag, you are in a perfect setup to fill a doe tag because you're going to catch those does going their natural bed to feeding pattern. But you also kind of always have that glimmer of hope that you have that mature buck that's going to come through and check out the feeding area first, check out the downwind side, and then he's going to go continue and check the downwind side of that bedding area. So this is a really good example of what my typical kind of peak rut, early rut setup looks like. It's trying to get between bedding and feeding, but staying on the downwind side so that hopefully the does don't bust me. Because does are very good at that. For all the decade-long hunters in here, we've all been screamed at does or by does for a long time, and you get tired of it after a while. So a setup like this is hopefully advantageous to keep those does from sneaking in behind you. Now, I did get a private message from somebody that they brought up a really good point, that they picked D, but it seems impossible to get into without spooking deer. And that is a very good point to bring in. Now, in this specific example, I've hunted this area a few times. And if you notice this valley at the bottom, there is a creek, and it's a walkable creek. So when I hunted this specific site, I was able to sneak in that creek bed and then just kind of very slowly get up this ridge and hunt between them. Now, this specific example is a fairly aggressive approach because you are so close to that doe bedding area. Now, in this specific example with the wind direction, D can be a little bit of a toss-up, because if they come out of the southern side of this bedding area and try to sneak around, they're instantly going to wind you. But this is a very good setup to try to catch that cruising buck who's searching the downwind side of normal doe feeding areas and normal doe bedding areas, as well as the downwind side of a doe travel corridor. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jason.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Dan. And we'd like to say thank you to everybody who attended this evening. We hope it was educational for you all. If you have any questions, we will stick around and answer them for any Q&A that you'd like to ask us, or if you haven't gotten to your question yet in the chat, sorry, but we can answer those now. If you restate those, we can answer them. If you're not familiar with Illinois Learn to Hunt, we usually do workshops, normally on weekends when we're able to. Unfortunately, during these times, we haven't been able to do that, so we have been doing a lot more doing webinars and online learning and Q&As and stuff like that. So unfortunately, we haven't been able to do that, but when we were able to, we will let you know that when those get picked back up. A good way to find out about that would be to check out our website or check out our Facebook to see any updates that we have come down the pipe. Our Facebook page, I think, is a pretty good one just to follow. We put up any type of new legislation coming out or reminders for all the different lotteries that you need to fill out for Illinois hunting. So we try not to bug anyone too much with useless information, and it's usually pretty pertinent to hunters in Illinois. Another thing I'd like to point out is if you're not able to attend a webinar and you're still interested in learning more about a topic, we have our e-learning modules that you can find at our website, and those are over here on the left-hand side. So you can click any of these and go through this similar information at your own pace. They average about 45 minutes or so, so you can click through those and kind of get some information as well. So if you're interested in doing waterfowl, deer, turkey, or upland bird, those are there at any time at your leisure. You can go and check those out. And also feel free to reach out to us at any time, email us or Facebook message us, and we will get back to you in a timely manner. And we are here as a resource for you guys. So anything you ever need, let us know. And with that, we can open up for any questions that just pop through there.
So a few questions, so I'll go ahead and take the first one. John Quintana asks, are any of the earlier webinars available for viewing? Yes. So we're still currently working out the best way to go about that. But we do have all of the webinars recorded, and we're looking for a way to, right now we're basically closed captioning them to ADA requirements, the American Disabilities Act. So we're going through and closed captioning those, and hopefully we'll have those all posted to our YouTube channel, and as well as our newsletter. There will be links to them all in there. So just stay tuned, and you'll get some more information on that. I will include, once this webinar is finished and closed captioning is been applied to the video, we will send the recording out, a link to the recording, as well as a PDF file of the slides. And in that email, we'll also go over, I'll list how to basically watch some of those other webinars, so you can go ahead and view that content as well. Another earlier question from Matt. He asks, when narrowing down sites as your prime areas, what features are you looking for when establishing a list? That's a great question. So the first thing that comes to mind for me is it's inaccessible to most people. Jason mentioned earlier that, you know, a quarter mile is the distance that a lot of hunters will travel from the access point to their kind of hunting location. So I use that as kind of reference, but also it's physical barriers too. So I know one specific public land piece I hunt, there's a very steep ridge backed by kind of a creek bottom that's probably 150 yards from a parking lot, and nobody will cross it because, you know, they don't want to get, if you happen to harvest one back there, it's going to be a task to get out. So those are kind of things I focus on first, is trying to find areas that are just underutilized by most hunters, or inaccessible to most hunters. I'm also looking for proximity to water. I think that's something that a lot of hunters, a lot of deer hunters don't spend too much time um, focusing on is on water. And so I like to have some kind of year-round water source somewhat adjacent. Even if it's 500 yards, that's close enough for me. I'm also looking for habitat structure. So I'm not looking for these open woodlands that are just kind of, they look like a park where there's just nothing growing on the understory. I try to find these really thick areas, and unfortunately, most Illinois woods are starting to look like that these days with bush honeysuckle and some of the other invasives starting to take over. Um, but those are some of the key features I'm looking for, as well as how can you get in there. So accessibility for you is important. Can you get into that specific location without spooking the bedding area or the feeding area that you want to hunt over? And last but not least, for me, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, I had a really good point too, I promise.
Last but not least, for
Oh,
me,
okay, yes. I got it. I got it. Last but not least, for me, when I pick a site, I like to be able to hunt that stand out of at least 2 or 3 wind directions, ideally 3, but more often 2. If it's just a stand that I can only hunt a specific wind direction out of, on public land, I really don't spend too much time with it, just because personally my schedule isn't extremely flexible, and so I can't sit around and wait for the perfect day to go hunt a stand. I just need to get out in the woods, and so I try to pick stands that can be hunted from several different wind directions, and I also try to encompass a certain area in stands. So if I'm hunting over a bedding area, I'll try to find 2 or 3 stand locations near that bedding area that can all be hunted out of different wind directions too. A lot of, because I only hunt public land in Illinois, and so for me, it's really important to have options. Several times I've tried, going into my stand and you see somebody there with a flashlight already, so you're kind of bummed. But if you have that background and that backup plan, it can be really, really, really important just to kind of have that. So those are some of the key things that I look for. Looks like we had a question from Ryan Irvin. Would you be willing to help break down a section of land privately? Sure. Shoot us either an email, a Facebook message, anything, Instagram message, and we'd be happy to kind of give you some guidance and hopefully help you out a little bit.
Awesome. Any other questions before we get going here? Some good questions tonight for sure.
Yeah, so we just had a nice question about a tree that I don't think I've heard of in a long time, sawtooth oak. I really like sawtooth oak. I know QDMA, the Quality Deer Management Association, has put a lot of stock in sawtooth oaks. And I think they were brought in from Asia in the 1920s. I believe so, if I recall. But they are a very good food source for deer. Now, personally, I'm of the belief that I would rather plant native species for wildlife. But a lot of people do plant sawtooth oak and have a lot of success deer hunting near it, or deer hunting, adjacent to it. So it can be really good, especially because the sawtooth oaks have a fairly early acorn drop. I think they're one of the first that drop early. So they would actually drop before your white oaks and before any of your red oaks. So they can be good, but I don't have any experience planting them on a private place. But yes, there are a lot of people that recommend them for deer habitat and deer hunting. David, just found out I didn't get the special unit tag I put in for. Now to find another spot. I know the feeling a little bit too well. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. We had one more question from John. Is there a lot of pressure from other species hunting like squirrel or rabbit? No, particularly not in public land in Illinois. So a lot of the Illinois DNR public sites actually close down squirrel season during deer season. And so a lot of the sites, once archery season starts, squirrel season kind of closes down. And so the majority of the sites, you're not going to encounter too much pressure. I've hunted plenty of sites that squirrel hunters, rabbit, and pheasant hunters are out there, and I haven't noticed any unique disadvantage to being out there. Obviously, there are people that spend a lot of time out there, but I'll give you an example. One of the sites that I hunt basically, most often, it's got very heavily used equestrian trails. So there's equestrian trails out there all day, every day. There's a lot of people out there, and I think deer start to notice that and start to get, like I said a little bit earlier, not get used to it, but get more comfortable with it. It's predictable movement, and rabbit hunters are a little bit the same way because they're out in the fields. They're not going through a lot of, feeding areas, and they're not really, if they are going through a bedding area, it's probably a doe bedding area. The does, they'll get used to it and they'll be back in there in a few days. So I don't think that's going to affect pressure too much. Well, with that, I think we will call it an evening. So I just want to thank you guys all for joining us tonight. We hope you learned something, and deer season is just a few months away, so we're getting close. We'll have a lot more of these type of webinars coming up in the next few months as we kind of approach hunting season. So just kind of stay tuned to all of our channels, and we'll see you soon. We did have one more question that I'll quickly address. How do you feel about leaving stands year-round versus taking down? If you have the ability to leave a stand, I don't see any huge issues with leaving it. Now, personally, I don't leave it just because I'm very mobile. Even if I were to hunt private land, I think I wouldn't leave a stand just because I'm a tinkerer. I like to try new things and move around and kind of micromanage my hunting a little bit. And so for my instance, in the way I hunt, I personally like to kind of move them around a little bit. But with that, we will close it down. So again, thank you guys and have a wonderful evening.